seeing everyone here. So thanks to David and Mercer for this invitation. This is the first time Paulin and I have been to Atlanta. We've had just a great time in the last day and a half here. And I think we might come back just for another round at the fair. Apparently, sea dragons are a thing. I'm particularly excited to speak at Mercer, however, because it's a place which takes its religious identity seriously. It's refreshing in particular because much of the time in my work I feel, frankly, on the defensive when it comes to having particular views that come from my faith. Debating with Peter Singer a lot. He's a man who supports, as you may know, infanticide and euthanasia of disabled human beings. You think he would be the one that got the tough questions when I go on debates with him in various places. He likes to joke with me that he's glad that when I come with him on debates, I'm the one that gets the hard questions, because I'm coming from the religious perspective, or a religious perspective. It doesn't really need to be said that medicine and bioethics today are very secular enterprises. You all here in Atlanta know this better than most. You have a tremendous amount of very impressive healthcare here, but most of it comes at it from a secular perspective. It didn't used to always be this way. Historically, the healer was almost always associated with the spiritual in some way. The church, in fact, invented and ran what we recognize as the first hospitals. Anyone who knows Christ knows him to be a powerful healer, so much that many of the earliest icons of Christ were as a physician. In my tradition in particular, the Catholic tradition, has been concerned for doing medicine and bioethics for a very long time. Huge Catholic healthcare systems in the U.S. The first medical ethics textbooks were written by Catholic priests. I could go on and on. But as the West became less Christian and more pluralistic, we've largely dropped the explicit theological language out of the public discourse more generally, and in medicine and bioethics in particular. And it has dropped out, as it has dropped out, most secular bioethics circles have grown not just more secular, but more suspicious of religion, as naive or unhelpful at best, or nefarious and destructive at worst. A recent article in the American Journal of Bioethics not only called for secular bioethics, but what the author calls irreligious bioethics. A bioethics that he wants to be actively hostile towards religious belief. This was a target article, a main article in the American Journal of Bioethics. The main professional society for bioethicists is called the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, and all of my colleagues who do theological bioethics know that if you submit a paper to them that has explicit theology in it, be prepared for that paper to be rejected, simply because it has explicit theology. In fact, I'm giving a paper there at the annual meeting in 2 weeks on theology and the use of animals in research, medical research. But the only reason I can do this is because it got accepted with the Evening Christian Bioethics Working Group. It would never be accepted as a regular paper. So in a more secular context, the current question actually is, can we do bioethics with religion? That's really a seriously open question, and for many secular bioethicists, the answer is no. But for many, it's yes, or maybe, or some complicated answer. But here at Mercer today, I hope to answer that question with an obvious yes, and to really ask the question, which I think is more interesting, can we do bioethics without religion? Now, for many people who care about bioethics, these might be fighting words. Perhaps even if you believe that theology and bioethics go together, you believe that secular people can do bioethics as well, and might even find it troubling that I suggest they might not. Now, I must say I do love a good argument, so I hope you ask your questions and question and answer about that. I grew up in an Italian family where our arguments over politics and religion approached something like a contact sport. And one thing I learned during those arguments was that even for us to have a coherent argument in the first place, the first thing we had to do was define our terms. So many arguments could be avoided if we simply defined our terms and we knew what each other was talking about and meant by a particular term. Today, we have much of what David talked about, yelling past each other and polarization and blah, blah, blah. We don't even engage the actual disagreement. In order to engage the actual disagreement, the first thing you have to do is define your terms. So let me take, actually, most of my talk to define my terms in the title. And in doing so, I hope to defend the thesis that no, you cannot do bioethics without religion. So I want to define 4 terms: bioethics, religion, we, and do. Start with bioethics. Strictly speaking, I think bioethics has to do with the moral issues surrounding bio, or life. But in practice, especially professionally, it tends to mean ethics, life ethics, as it interacts with medicine. It asks questions like, what is a person? What does it mean to heal? What does it mean to stop healing? What does it mean to kill? Can killing ever be healing? Can healthcare providers ever kill? Do healthcare providers have a vocation at all? Do healthcare providers treat diseases, or do they treat people? What does it mean to treat a person? What does it mean to treat a whole person? What is an acceptable or unacceptable quality of life? What should the relationship be between medicine and the making of money? What is the relationship of individual dignity to the common good? What is nature? In what respect, if any, should medicine pay to the natural world? That's already a very long list. I could keep going, but you get the gist. These questions, I hope it is obvious, are not answerable by the medical science. They are not medical questions. They are bioethical questions. And with that, it becomes a good time to try to define the second word, religion. Religion is notoriously difficult to define. I would argue that the word, as most of us use it today in the secular West, that word is not found in the Bible at all. There is a word that's sometimes translated as religion called gracia, which is often means something like piety or ceremony, ritual, the external practices of one's faith. But even that word is only found 4 times in the Old and New Testaments. At any rate, the idea that one can have a religious approach as opposed to a secular approach is entirely unbiblical, and in my view is an invention of the European Enlightenment. I would argue that the word religion is so difficult to define today precisely because we want it to be separate from the modes of thought that we think of as secular, but it turns out there doesn't appear to be any good way to do this. At least that's what I want to argue. For instance, we might think that religious belief must have to do with a god or gods, but then what about religions like many strains of Buddhism, for instance, who don't believe in what we would call a god? Perhaps if Buddhism counts as a religion, then what we really mean by religious belief is some kind of belief in the transcendent, or under some kind of nebulous concept like that. But if that's where we go, then why doesn't systems of thought like Marxism count as religion? Marx's story of transcendence involves the belief, as a matter of faith, that it is inevitable that the working class will rise up and be victorious against the rich classes which oppress them. If this sounds like it's suspiciously similar to the transcendent belief that Christians have, that Christ will come again to fully implement the kingdom of God, that's because it is suspiciously similar. Human beings have many different traditions of thought which have transcendent and irreducible understandings of the good. Christianity, Buddhism, Marxism, humanism, utilitarianism, feminism, and many, many more. Each of them is grounded in some kind of faith, often connected with their foundational, and I would even say sacred texts, Das Kapital, along with a priest or evangelical-like figure promoting it. Importantly, they all rely on first principles, which they do not come at by deductive arguments. These principles simply grab or claim them by some kind of intuition, faith, experience, or other authority. And there is no good reason, in my view, to distinguish between these traditions. The the ones we call religious today on the one hand, what we call secular on the other. All of these traditions of thought, if you dig down far enough, have a foundation of faith. Okay, what about the we? We did bioethics, we did religion, now let's talk about the we. Who is the we that could be doing bioethics? Healthcare providers? I know many of you are here, or future ones are for sure. Academics, a few of you here too. Congregants of the Baptist Church, Catholic Church, other churches. Religious people, whatever that means now. The plural, diverse people of the United States, of the world. The we, I would argue, is very much connected to the do, so let's skip to the do. Can we all get in a room together and do bioethics in the sense of simply talking about it? Like we'll do during question and answer? Yeah, we can talk about it. Almost always. Will we understand what the other person is saying? Even if we take the time to carefully define our terms, I think maybe not. And it doesn't even need to be that diverse a community for us to run into this problem, right? This happens within our own faith traditions, which supposedly have a common understanding of the good. I know what happens within my own Catholic Church. The liberal Catholics and the conservative Catholics almost seem to be speaking different languages when they have their arguments. I know the Baptist tradition recently went through a split that was maybe something similar, or analogous. This happens in academia. Theologians in particular find it difficult to engage with our secular colleagues. We're speaking different languages. Our secular colleagues often don't know what to do with this. Quick story about that. My colleague was in an interdisciplinary meeting maybe last year. They were going around the room saying, oh, so-and-so from sociology is performing this function, so-and-so from history is doing that function. And I'll just call him John Doe. John Doe from theology, he's here to pray for us. Right? Just, and how about these discussions in our country, right? We are the most polarized we've been since Civil War Reconstruction. Or should I say war between states Reconstruction? And we're often polarized, aren't we, around very different understandings of issues with regard to bioethics. Abortion, euthanasia, healthcare, delivery and reform. Stem cell research. Our country has more problems than most on this score because we attempt to welcome a plural group of citizens and people who have very, very, very different understandings of the good. Often these different understandings are what academics call incommensurate. To use a silly kind of example to define it, it's sort of like if someone asked me which I like better. Watching the Packers beat the Bears yesterday. I'm from Wisconsin. We're delivering a bioethics presentation to a wonderful audience like that. I'd say I don't even know how to compare them. Couldn't give you an answer. They're incommensurable. Something similar happens when we compare, say, a justice-centered tradition like Christianity, which asks us to follow Jesus in proclaiming justice for those on the margins of our culture, with a utilitarian perspective that doesn't even know how to make sense of the concept of justice. Utilitarians deny there's something like justice. Would even go against justice if it meant what we would consider justice, if it meant maximizing consequences for the many over the few. Maximizing good consequences for the many over the few. Bioethics has struggled with this problem because, as I said before, so much of what bioethics does is precisely ask these fundamental questions which rely on these deeply held fundamental understandings of the good. What is life? What is death? What is health? What is vocation? Etc., etc. Sadly, those today who are doing bioethics, especially in a clinical or hospital setting, have little to no formal training in moral theology or moral philosophy. I know this firsthand. The head of my ethics committee was just someone who was interested in ethics. He happens to be a very, very good doctor. No training in ethics, but he's the head of the ethics committee. And during my time in the committee, I've had to constantly explain, much to their annoyance, right, that your training as a medical doctor is impressive and important, but it has nothing to do with the questions of bioethics. Except as dad, right? So you could say, well, this is probably pretty painful for them, or this is the prognosis or something. When it comes to answering and asking those very questions, they're not medical questions. They don't have medical answers. Especially, for instance, when it comes to deciding whether a life is worth living or not. That's a classic frustration. A lot of physicians think that they can tell whether a life is worth living or not. They can't. In fact, just a quick story about that. There was a very domineering father, this children's hospital where I work, who wanted the feeding tube removed from his mentally disabled child, saying that the tube was causing the child, the fact that it was on the feeding tube was causing the child to suffer. And the doctor had to say, well, actually your child doesn't suffer. The tube is not causing the child to suffer. And so what really, and he didn't want to take the tube out, the physician did not want to take the tube out. What they were really arguing about was whether this child had a sufficiently acceptable quality of life. Now I happen to agree with the physician on that one. I think the child should have been kept the feeding tube, the G-tube. But the physician can't say, based on my medical opinion, this tube should stay in. That's a question about, for moral theology, moral philosophy, bioethics. I could tell you another story, maybe I'll tell a question and answer, so I want to make sure to save time for that. So how do you think bioethics is dealing with this problem when it comes to incommensurable understandings of the good in our plural culture? Well, our solution has been to say, everyone make up your own mind about these questions. Individual autonomy. Live and let live. Make your own decisions. Just don't hurt anyone else. And then just make your own decisions. And this can work sometimes, but not with our most difficult topics. For instance, how do we know when our decisions are hurting someone else? How do we know that someone else is there? That's a big question, right? Is someone there when we're talking about stem cell research? Talk about euthanasia, brain dead individuals? There, the precise question, is someone there at all? And if you say yes, someone's being hurt. Say no, then they're not being hurt. But you can't really get around it by saying everyone make their own decisions, just don't hurt anyone. We need a particular understanding of the good to answer the most difficult questions. And other problems, right? Like, what is suffering? You say, just don't cause anyone harm. Christians make room for suffering. It's not always a thing to be avoided at all costs. At least if we have Jesus as our model. Right? You say autonomy, well, what about those who don't have autonomy? How about prenatal children, neonatal children, or just children? We say, well, we locate the child's autonomy in her parents' decision, right? But really what the parent is making a decision on the basis of what the parent thinks is in the best interest of her child. We call it the best interest standard. It's not autonomy by any sense. It's certainly not the child's autonomy. And what about when autonomous decisions conflict or autonomous interests conflict? In the Catholic world, we're having a debate with the Obama administration at the moment about whether Catholic hospitals and other institutions should pay for abortifacient contraception, or what many believe is abortifacient contraception, for their employees. And the argument on the side of the administration is, don't mess with the autonomous choice of women to have control over their bodies and reproductive systems. And of course, what's the argument from the Catholic hospitals? Don't mess with our autonomy in choosing how we're going to compensate our employees. You say, well, how are we going to solve this problem with autonomy? The answer is you're not going to be able to solve it with autonomy. Because there's two autonomies that are in conflict with each other. You have to appeal to a particular understanding of the good to resolve that conflict. How are we going to do this in a pluralistic culture that makes room for multiple understandings of the good? I think our culture has absolutely no idea. No idea. And sometimes when I think about this, like, it's very easy for me anyway to get pulled into the temptation offered by Nietzsche, who said, yeah, you can talk about your academic debates all you want. This, that point of view, this, that argument. It just comes down to power at the end of the day. Whoever has power pushes it on others. Whoever has power next pushes it on others. It's all about power. I'm not ready to go there yet, so it's a temptation for me to go there. I think we can, at least for the moment, still appeal to something like the flourishing of human beings and gain broad consent in our culture. I think we all have a sense in our culture, or most of us have a sense in our culture, about when a life is being well lived and when a life is not. And you can get a long way with that. Not everywhere we get a long way with that. I think this is true because, at least at our foundations, Christian theology is still at the bottom of our culture. And what our culture believes about what a flourishing life looks like. So that's a contested claim, obviously. But I think it's still there, even if it's not acknowledged. But as non-Christians rightly continue to challenge these foundations and say, hey, guess what? We live in a pluralistic culture. This particular understanding of good, a Christian one, it shouldn't be something that I'm limited by. It's going to become more and more and more plural and less and less able as a culture to say that's a good life and that's a bad one, or that's a flourishing one, that's a less flourishing. And perhaps, and I'm interested in what you think about this, but perhaps we'll need to give up our focus on pluralism and instead focus on local communities which have more shared understandings of the good. In fact, this country was founded with a version of this idea in mind, right? Local communities which had very different understandings of the good everywhere, given wide latitude to live out their particular understanding of the good more locally. I don't know if you've been watching the PBS special on the Roosevelts, but I think maybe the Roosevelts were a key move in our nation's history with regard to that. We moved away from that view, more towards trying to mold ourselves into one big community. But I wonder if we aren't starting to see a backlash against this, and not just in the United States. So many of you may have followed the movement for independence in Scotland. I think that was based in large part on Scotland saying, we are so different from England and certainly the people that are ruling us in London, that it's time for us to go have our own understanding of the good as Scottish people and be autonomous. I think we see this with the arbitrary lines drawn around countries like Iraq and Syria, right? You just arbitrarily draw a line around and say, well, that's a country. Well, not really. Ukraine, another example. We know this all too well in the United States, right? It's almost, if you're ever in Texas and New York in the same day, you wonder in what sense they're the same country. Right? So I wonder if the project of pushing people together who believe very different things about the good and calling them a community is looking increasingly unstable. And at least on this side of the kingdom of God, maybe a true community needs to be held together by a more robust, thick, common understanding of the good. So what's the answer? Can we do bioethics without religion? As long as we identify religion as a tradition of thought with a faith-based understanding of the good, then I think the answer is no, we can't do bioethics without religion. And if that's true, I'll conclude with three very important implications of this for bioethics. First, we should be upfront about this in all of our discussions about bioethics. We should not pretend that physicians or others with medical training have any special insight into these bioethical questions. Indeed, sometimes their privileged position makes them really bad at bioethics. There's a study done that shows that physicians, it compares physicians rating the quality of life of their patients versus patients themselves rating their quality of life. And because of the privileged nature of physicians, they almost always rate their patients' quality of life less than the patients themselves. So not only is the role of the physician, not only does it not give them some special insight, I think it actually hurts. So that's the first one. Let's just be upfront about what this is. Second, perhaps the best place to deliver health care is within a particular community that shares a common understanding of the good. So I think a class, there are multiple examples of this, but maybe a classic example would be a religiously affiliated hospital. And Catholics and Baptists have been doing this for a very long time. In fact, in my bioethics class at Fordham, I'm teaching the story of the former Baptist hospital, now called Memorial Hospital, or I don't know what it's called now, maybe it's Baptist again, in New Orleans that was affected by Hurricane Katrina. It's a amazing story. And third and finally, religious believers should not shrink from our religious convictions in public discussions of bioethical issues. We should respectfully but firmly challenge the faith claims of our secular opponents. If they're in fact opponents, right? Maybe they're not. Excluding religious traditions from the discussion, in my view, is not only a kind of bigotry, it's bad for bioethics. I have more I could say here, but I'm going to stop there. So, yeah.